do this? I just want to check. Yep. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming along to our Local Government Conference 2019 on what is quite a grey, overcast and maybe threatening to rain day in Glasgow. But we'll have none of that in here. We'll keep it all nice and light and frothy. We're being honoured this morning to have with us Rosemary Agnew, the SPSO, and Maureen Faulkner from the Information Commissioner's Office, who are going to be speaking in the first and second slots this morning. Please do feel free to ask them questions. They are here for your benefit. Poor Rosemary is suffering from a heavy cold, so we're just going to give her 5 or 10 minutes to catch her breath. I'm going to talk very briefly this morning on the dreaded subject of Brexit, but you'll be glad to know I'm not going to be talking about the law. If, however, you would like to know about the law after Brexit, we will be hosting very shortly a Brexit seminar focused directly at the local government market, where people much brighter than me will be speaking about law after Brexit, whatever shape Brexit might eventually take. I don't know if many of you receive the Legal Matters Scotland updates, but one of them popped into my inbox this morning, and I was intrigued to learn that Cardiff University had run a survey of Leavers and Remainers, and the outcome of that survey was that 71% of those polled in England, 60% of those polled in Scotland, and 70% of those polled in Wales, that's both Leavers and Remainers, thought that violence against MSPs was a price worth paying for Brexit. So I was pretty shocked by that outcome, because it made me wonder what is happening in Scotland. Why only 60%? What I did want to touch on was a survey that was done by the Local Government Information Unit that looked at what chief executives were thinking in the run-up to Brexit, and particularly what they might be concerned about in the event of a no-deal Brexit. So looking at these little lenses, as we now call them in Brodie's, over half of the chief executives who were polled by the Local Government Information Unit said that they had as one of their top priorities planning for Brexit. So 57% of chief executives had that as a top priority, planning for a no-deal Brexit. Over half of them were more concerned about the outcome of the Brexit situation on their council, more concerned this year than they were last year. So the concern was rising. In terms of communication, only a fifth of them think that the communication from central government has been good. Over half think it's been average, and a quarter think that it's been poor. I was intrigued to find out that 87% of those polled were saying that they had up to 3 full-time equivalent staff members dedicated solely to working on Brexit. I don't think that is the norm north of the border. Almost 2/3 of them said that they were engaging in Brexit planning on a daily basis. For those who were worried about a no deal, 79% of them were very worried, and 21% were not that worried about a no deal Brexit. What did seem to be perplexing most chief executives was that although there was a lot of chat about Brexit and the likely impact of that on local government, and although they were having to plan for it, 92% of chief executives were concerned that there's been no cash diverted to local authorities to meet or help meet the impact of Brexit. So what were the issues? What were the key concerns that were identified? The top issue for chief executives appears to be that they have concerns that in the event of no Brexit deal in particular, there may be difficulties with outsourcing services, and that supplier contracts might be disrupted. So quite a big issue for them. Unsurprisingly, there were concerns about the movement of people and goods and traffic, and that seemed to be a bigger issue for those in the South East who were more concerned about ports and customs. If you take those last two statistics together, it's maybe not surprising that just under half of the chief executives polled were concerned about the rising cost of service delivery. They were also concerned about unplanned financial delays. That seemed to be tacked on, I think, to the loss of EU funding and whether or not there were suitable replacements being put in place by central government. But surprisingly, to me, I think 40% of those polled were concerned that there might be civil unrest in the event of a no-Brexit deal. I don't know if that includes the violence that might be aimed at MPs. So a lot for chief executives to be worried about, and a lot of chief executives thinking about Brexit. What was most surprising overall was that the Local Government Information Unit reported that the poll had returned a very low percentage of chief executives being willing to participate. And I don't think that really surprised me all that much, because it seems to me that Brexit is Brexit. The debate continues. Heaven knows where we'll actually land. But local government still has to continue delivering services. You're delivering services with tighter budgets, less finance, fewer members of staff than you have done in the past, and you're constantly firefighting as things stand. I think what most chief executives are saying, if you look at the results of this, and particularly the low poll, is that we've got much more to be getting on with than to be worrying about the consequences of something that's coming down the line, the shape of which we don't yet know. So that's all I was going to say, just by way of a general introduction, just an easy start to the morning. And now, hopefully, if Rosemary has got her breath back after racing from the train station. Rosemary, as many of you will know, is the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman. She's going to speak to us this morning about the work that her team does with local government, perhaps identifying some trends, and perhaps speaking about how local authorities might engage better with the SPSO.
I'll start with the apology. If you can't hear me, I'm really sorry, but I am shouting. On the 26th of March, I was in Brussels, and it was the day we were supposed to be leaving the EU, and it didn't happen. On the 31st of October, I'm going to be in The Hague. I don't think the Brexit will happen that day either. So I reckon what I have to do is keep going to Europe on the day that we're going to leave. I just thought I would, because it's quite a short space of time, take you through what the SPSO's statutory function is, because as a public service ombudsman, we have a very odd set of duties. And I say odd because we've got a number of things that are all sort of lumped together. Take you through some of the very headline statistics for complaints as a whole, but local authorities as well, because local authorities' statistics are actually quite interesting. And then talk maybe a bit about themes and trends, but I was trying to think of things that might be of more wide interest, and I thought I would share with you some of the debates that ombudsmen have been having about ombudsmaning, because local authorities amongst public bodies in Scotland, I think, are fairly unique, because you're not a single function organisation. You have lots of different things that you do. So actually a lot of the issues and things that affect individual organisations can affect local authorities specifically. So what do we do? Well, obviously, final stage for complaints about Scottish public services. So it goes through a complaints process with you, and then it comes to us if the person remains unhappy. Critically, we set complaint standards and we monitor public sector complaint handling performance. That's quite an interesting one, because it's the area of work that we're currently most doing development of our own business on. And very specific to local authorities, we are the final stage for the Welfare Fund with a Welfare Fund review service. This is not a trick question. Do you know what the Welfare Fund is? No, it's not a trick question, because a lot of people don't know. Basically, the government set up a fund for the most needy in society, and this is either one-off payments of small amounts of money, £50 to £100, or goods or something in kind, like a bed or a carpet. So if you are homeless and have just been given somewhere to live, you can apply to have some basic furniture. And this was largely in response to changes that were being made to the UK welfare benefits system, and trying to make sure that Scotland, the most vulnerable, were not disadvantaged. So basically, you apply for a welfare fund grant, 2 different sorts, and if you don't get it or you're not happy with the award, you can come to the Ombudsman, and that is unique to local authorities. Now, in addition to all of the above, we give advice, guidance, training, we intervene when we see poor performance by public bodies. So we're much more than just complaint handlers, and it's that more than just complaint handlers work which we've been developing more over time. So, for example, in the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot more on analysing and collating our own data about complaints. Because what we tended to do is what a lot of public service regulatory scrutiny type bodies do, is say, oh, we've seen something wrong there, it must be universal across the whole of public sector. And actually what we're finding is that there are some things that are universal across the public sector, but different sectors have different issues. And I would say of all of the sectors right now, and I will explain why in a moment, I think probably local authorities are the most ahead in effective complaint handling. Now, those are the things we do now. One of the reasons they're all mixed up, and they're not traditional ombudsmaning things, is because we're quite a small jurisdiction. And what you'll find is Northern Ireland, their public services ombudsman, has a mixture of things. They do complaint handling, but they do all sorts of other things as well. Welsh ombudsman for public services, they have a mixture of things, and it's because our jurisdictions are small that very often we got given an extra bit of work because it's frankly cheaper than setting up a new organisation. Now we're about to be given something else as well, and this is the one that is probably keeping me awake at night at the moment. Well, it would be if I wasn't coughing all the time. And it's the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer for the NHS in Scotland. I have to take a breath in the middle of that. Now, what is that? You can't have failed to have seen over the last few months things in the papers about whistleblowing in the NHS, reports about bullying in the NHS, and all of this goes back to, the action that's been taken goes back to the Francis report, where the Scottish Government have and are in the process of putting in a different sort of framework in relation to whistleblowing in the NHS. And it's alongside other policies such as bullying policies, grievance, HR. But it's crucially, at what point, if you blow the whistle, do you get the protections that go with it? And what this means for us is that from probably July next year, I was told off for saying July by the government last week because it started off as being April last year. And every time I say a date, oh no, don't give a definitive date. We're hoping that the legislation is going through this week. But what it means is that we have a set of duties that sort of mirrors what we do with complaints. We set standards for handling whistleblowing concerns. We are the final stage, and we monitor public bodies' performance, or NHS. What makes it different to complaints is that a complaint is about an individual's service that they have received. They, as an individual, received the service, not happy with it. Whistleblowing can concern something that somebody has witnessed or observed in relation to patient safety, which is a fundamentally different sort of complaint, if you like. Now, my duties will enable me to look at the way in which the whistleblowing concern was handled and the treatment of any person. Now, any person is literally any person, and it's something that I fought quite hard for because it seems to me that it's not just whistleblowers who need protections, it's actually those who give witness statements, those who are whistleblown against, because not all whistleblowing allegations are founded, and anybody who is part of that process, because it's quite obvious from talking amongst stakeholders that one of the concerns about speaking up is even if somebody else speaks up first, you still don't want to join in. And that actually came to a head with the Highland NHS, the GPs who whistleblew, and John Sturrock QC, who did the inquiry into that. What he found was, as soon as one or two people had put their head above the parapet and they didn't suffer detriment as such, lots of other people came forward. So my big concern at the moment is I have no idea how big or small a function that's going to be. Now, why is it relevant to local authorities? Well, it doesn't affect you directly, but one of the areas that we still find a little challenging, and I think local authorities do, is in health and social care partnerships. And it strikes me that there could be a delivery of health and care in a package where the person who observes it is a social worker. They work for the local authority. They're not covered by this legislation. So I think there are some things about it that will take a while to bed in, if you like. So complaint numbers. I know they look boring on the screen, but actually they're not that boring. So my office last year received 4,188 complaints. The year before, 4,125. There's only a 2% increase. Now, although it was only a 2% increase, what we are finding is that our complaints are getting more complex. And we are investigating a greater proportion of them. So it used to be that a much greater proportion of things would be out jurisdictionally, or we wouldn't be looking at them for some reason. But now we are looking at more than we would have looked at before. And I think the clue as to why that is actually borne out with local authority complaints. Because last year, local authority complaints were 31% of our caseload. And it's been a fairly consistent sort of proportion, if you like, for many years. But this year, compared to previous years, we actually saw a 12% decrease in the number of complaints about local authorities. Now, compare that to the 2% increase overall, and we have to ask, I wonder why. And I think this comes back to the model complaints handling and the standard complaints handling across Scotland. So when I said we set complaint standards, there is in Scotland, and we are still unique in this, other ombudsmen are catching up, but there is a standard complaint process, tweaks around the edges for different sectors, for any public service complaint in Scotland. Stage 1, Stage 2, off to the Ombudsman. Now, the local authority complaints, what we're finding is that you're pretty good at the Stage 1, early resolution. Sort it out in 5 days. In fact, I think it's something like in excess of 80% of local authority complaints are handled at Stage 1. Now, what that means is that the complaints that go through the system are the ones that are the Stage 2, more complex, require more investigation, are more complex issues. And that's being borne out in all of our work, where the success of having a standard complaints process is that our caseload is getting more difficult to manage and investigate. What is also, I think, quite significant about the decrease in local authority complaints is this is despite us having extra powers over the last couple of years, which is we can challenge social work decisions. So we can challenge professional decisions of social workers. which again is fairly unique among ombudsmen. We're not social workers, by the way. We have a panel, well, not really a panel, a pool of clinical, social work, planning experts who are under contract to us, and they provide expert advice on individual cases. Now, what is significant as well, I think, is that for all complaints across the board, the uphold rate is pretty similar. It's about 58%. It's slightly lower for some sectors, but on the whole, it's pretty standard. So even that, a 58% uphold rate, in full or part, is actually quite low for a complaint handling organisation now. And I think that, again, is a reflection of organisations are getting better at handling complaints. Now, there's another reason why that is so significant, and that is underpinning all of this is, A, putting things right for people, but it's also about learning from your complaint handling. And it strikes me that we can't say nobody's learning anything if complaint numbers are going down. I think it's also significant that the local authorities were the first to take on model complaint handling. So it's the maturest sector, and I would hope that we see the same pattern reflected in other sectors over the years. Now, that's quite a good news story. Not such good news for us is Scottish Welfare Fund. When this was introduced, there was an estimate done of how much business it would bring. And unfortunately, that estimate has proven to be out somewhat. So we're seeing we've got 31% more work than we had 3 years ago. Now, we think that one of the main contributory factors to this is actually universal credit, because what we're talking about is, you know, very small one-off payments for my benefit hasn't come through. I lost my wallet is a favourite one, but believe it or not, people do actually lose their wallets, especially if you're living a disrupted lifestyle or you're on the streets or what have you. And what we found was that over the years, the number has not just risen a little bit, it's taken a very high rise. Now, what's different about Welfare Fund is there is a central government grant to all of the councils, but different councils have added extra money in. They can top this up themselves. And I would say the council with the biggest number of applications is Glasgow, actually, has the greatest number of work. And what we're finding we're doing is quite a lot of work with some of the larger councils to try and help them get more efficient at what they're doing, because if we're seeing a rise, it means you're seeing a rise. And what that is part of, I mentioned we're trying to develop our business more in terms of not just doing complaint handling. We decided to take a good hard look at our statutory powers. You'd think it's obvious, wouldn't you? You've got a statutory framework. What is it? Let's work in it. But I think when you've sort of culturally grown up as being a complaint handling body, you tend to focus on handling complaints. And where we have the greatest impact is actually not on individual complaints. That generally has impact for one person. You might get that odd, really precedental case that changes something for the whole of the sector. So we decided to take a different approach, and we monitor our own information differently, and we started making recommendations differently. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but when we respond to a complaint, make a decision on it, we make recommendations in 3 ways. There's individual redress, and incidentally, we, unlike the other ombudsmen in the UK, do not make compensatory or time and trouble payments. We will recommend reimbursement of direct quantifiable loss, because we don't feel that we are there to make decisions about compensation, particularly on things like health issues. And I learned that one a long time ago when I worked for the local government ombudsman, because somebody judicially reviewed us. Didn't judicially review us. They took an organisation to court to try and get more damages and more compensation than the ombudsman had awarded. And the outcome of it was, yeah, you probably would have got more, but the ombudsman gave you that, you've had your redress. And it's a different test. We test on reasonableness. So we look at this, what should happen for the individual, but we also make two other types of recommendation. Learning and improvement, and well over half of our recommendations are learning and improvement, and complaint handling. But we don't say to public bodies, you must rewrite this policy. We try and express it in terms of outcome. The outcome we would like you to achieve is this. Provide us with the evidence by. Probably the best example is one from the health sector, where somebody presented at a hospital. They just had a motorcycle accident, got a head injury. They had a scan in A&E, and it was the wrong type of scan. And by the time they got the right type of scan, the diagnosis was made and it was too late, and they ended up paralysed down one side of their body. Now, in the olden days, we'd have said, review your scanning policy, but an outcomes-focused approach is any patient presenting at A&E must get the right scan at the right time. So the evidence is that you have the systems in place to do this. We're finding that we're having greater impact by doing that. But we also monitor all these recommendations to look for themes. Now, I thought I'd go through them and find the themes for local authorities, but we don't really have any themes because a lot of the complaints are unique. So I would say that the most common thing actually relates to communication, and that's across the board. That's not just local authorities, because you occasionally get a complaint and you look at it and think, oh, if they just picked up the phone, you wouldn't be here now. And one for all the lawyers in the room. Are there any lawyers in the room? If they just put it into plain English, we wouldn't be here now. It's taken me many years to get used to reading unplain English, and it just so often becomes so obvious that we write in officialese, and we do it automatically because that's the way we communicate with each other. And we're finding that it's both frequency of communication, but also our record keeping. That's the other big theme that comes through, is that often you look into something and there just aren't the records there. And I understand it in a way, because we're all busy people. My guess is legal departments are much better at it because you've been trained differently. But the number of times that you ask for the public body's file on something and you think, where's the rest of it? And busy people just don't write stuff down or don't record it as well as they might. So there's a quick run through our complaints. So what do ombudsmen talk about? I'm a member of a couple of associations for ombudsmen. There's a UK and Ireland Ombudsman Association and an International Ombudsman Institute. Now, the IOI is the Public Service Ombudsman Commissioners, or as I met yesterday from Serbia, got the grand title of Public Protector of the People. I thought, yeah, I like that one. So the reason I've mentioned this one is because I think this is an area that probably is relevant to local authorities. And it's an increasing recognition that complaints are not just complaints, that they don't all have the same characteristics. and that this is important because it can direct how you handle them, and I think may well account for some of why local authorities are able to resolve so many complaints at first stage. Because what we're finding is that complaints are sort of two types. They're what I refer to as transactional. You know, my bin wasn't emptied for the third time last Thursday. It's very different to the way that you have been handling my access to my children, and the social worker has been looking at the way that I look after my children, and all of these things. They're very different. One is very much, there was a service, it either was there or wasn't there. The other is very much more nuanced. It has different standards, guidelines, and what have you in place, and they are resolved in different ways. So good examples of transactional are things like purchase or consumption of goods. Now, I know individuals don't necessarily purchase goods from local authorities. You might pay for a planning application, but a lot of it is based on, fairly defined services. Often they're single subject services in a particular area. You, as public bodies, as local authorities, have a range of these, but increasingly we're seeing ombudsmen who are there for single subjects, and their jobs are much easier because they're either issues-based or they're transactional-based. But what this is can affect is how straightforward and efficient they are, but it also can affect how you focus on remedy or recompense or replacement or fixing something, because if you are the financial ombudsman service and a particular service is not delivered, there is a set amount of compensation you pay somebody. Now, we don't do that in the public sector, and nor would I want us to. But there are things that we could regularise in terms of particular services that aren't provided. Now, these transactional type things are well suited to policy approaches. If you don't get that, we will do this by. And I would urge particularly local authorities to think about some of these. The other thing is about mediation. Now, I have mixed feelings about mediation because I came to Scotland to work for the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission, and that built into law, you must consider mediation. Now, mediation is fine for many things, but it's confidential if it's truly done properly. Now, mediation can be good for transactional things. I personally don't think it's that great for issues-based stuff because you don't really get to the root of what went wrong, which is probably what's more important. But the other thing is about considering how learning from complaints happen, because on transactional type complaints, you probably don't learn a lot on one complaint, probably don't learn a lot from 10 complaints. But you do learn more from patterns over time than maybe on some of the more complex issues-based complaints. And I don't know, but I wonder whether one of the reasons local authorities resolve so many things at first hand is because they have learned about a particular type of complaint and have put in place a way of dealing with those very quickly. I won't name the council, but there is one who had a lot of complaints about refuse collection and put in a very different approach to how you report it and how it gets resolved, which meant it didn't escalate to complaint status every time. Now, issues-based complaints are much more complex, and I would say that they're more complex because they have a more of a behavioural issue to them. And they're as much to do with conduct, with relationships, and they can go across an organisation or a sector. And you don't really see that many ombudsmen outside the public sector who deal with these type of complaints. They're very often indicative of systemic issues. And as I say, we haven't found any or many systemic issues for local authorities, because pretty much if you do find something, it tends to be related to either the complaint or the complainer as much as the local authority. These are more likely to lead to regulatory action. They're more likely to lead to us actually requiring something being done. And these are the ones more likely to be investigated. Because when we get a complaint, we don't automatically say, oh, let's go and investigate it. Is it in jurisdiction? Are we allowed to? And then we ask, should we? Because I'm acutely aware that public services are not well funded, but you'll be acutely aware of that too. And there's also a thing about expectation as well. I want people to have good public service. I'm a citizen myself. I value good public service. But I don't think that my office should be investigating every single thing that somebody is unhappy with. So one of the things that we do more often now than we've done in the past is we actually look at how the public body investigated it themselves and what outcome they came up with. And if the outcome they came up with recognised a fault, put it right, which we would follow up, and we could achieve no more for the complainer, we don't investigate it. We close it down at that point, because it's not fair on people to go through what could be anything from 3 to 9 months just to tell them the same answer that they had in the first place. Strangely enough, it's more popular with public bodies than it is with complainers, but sometimes all people are looking for is reassurance, so it works okay. Now, the issues complaints are much more opportunistic for looking for learning, because what you tend to find are issues with systems, issues with policies or guidance that you wouldn't necessarily find in something more transactional, like my bin wasn't emptied. Now, one of the other big things that public bodies, ombudsmen are talking about is the use of ADR. There's this increasing, I think we forget, we are part of the system of ADR, but increasingly it's, well, you should be trying alternative dispute resolution methods yourselves. Now, I don't think it's suitable for all complaints, but also by the time things reach us, it's often too late, because you've got entrenched positions and there are some fairly serious things that we probably need to understand properly and put right. And I think for complaints in the widest sense, yes, if there is a mediation approach, yes, if there is a resolution-based approach, that's great. And actually the skills that go with ADR are really, really good skills to have. But we risk, by trying to do a quick fix, losing some of the learning that actually would make the difference to future things as well. Now, learning is really important, because we need to learn from all complaints. It's a requirement, actually. Part of the model complaints handling is about learning from complaints. So it's not just about process, it's also about embedding things in governance as well. And senior people taking responsibility for ensuring this happens. Now, recommendations are really important, but also how they're enforced is important. Now, enforced is a strange word for an ombudsman to use, because I have no enforcement powers. If somebody decides not to comply with an ombudsman recommendation, then I can put a special report before Parliament. I've never had to do that, and neither have my two predecessors. And you've no idea how powerful a phrase it is, well, nobody's ever had to do that before. But if you'd like to be the first... now, actually, joking aside, I think there is something to think about in whether we should almost be working together. we find something that you can't comply with or would have such an impact on other areas of service that it probably needs a wider debate. And it seems to me us putting a special report worded in a suitable way could have more impact on raising debate about things. So when I say we're trying to think about ways of having more impact with our complaints, that is one of them. What am I doing for time? So laws, codes, standards, guidance, these are all really important. And if you're ever asked to look at anything that is complaint related, there are a number of things. Is were they complied with, but also what do people do if they don't exist? Because where we see the most inconsistency in organisations is where everybody's policy is slightly different, or even within a single authority their policies are slightly different. And it's not about standardisation, it's about consistency, because ultimately our starting point is what should have happened. And legislative framework, codes of practice, policies are where we go to for what should have happened. So it's really important that everybody understands them. So how do you add value? Well, one of the things that I can't do is a public value or an own initiative investigation. I'm one of the few, what we refer to as the Celtic Ombudsman, Northern Ireland, Wales, Scotland. The other two have own initiative powers, we don't. This is where your decision to investigate something is either intelligence-led or it's because somebody has made a complaint to you that they will not put their name to because they're afraid of the repercussions. It's where you think there is something worth investigating that could have wider impact. So the Irish Ombudsman, for example, did a really powerful investigation into, I remember the what were they, the Magdalen laundries? Yeah, he did a wider investigation into that, and fairly significant changes came about because of it. The area for me that's very frustrating is my powers to share information are very, very limited. And they have not been made worse by GDPR because basically they were so restrictive in the first place. But I think what we're finding is, and you know, if you find your experience is different, but I reckon the public sector in Scotland, we could put our heads together and come up with a list of 25 people, and we would have at least 15 of them in common. It's individuals who, for whatever reason, are making various complaints, appeals to the Information Commissioner, to the Scottish Information Commissioner, who pop up with GMC, GTC, local authority, and I sometimes get concerned that they are using our lack of ability to share information to perpetuate complaints that probably, if we could all compare notes, we could come up with a resolution much more quickly. Monitoring enforcement, important. We do our best to raise awareness. For public bodies, we offer training, but we also are part of each sector has a network of complaint handlers, and local authority network is probably the most active, and we provide guidance and support. And then really, I just did what I thought, so ask any questions you want.
Does anyone have any questions for Rosemary this morning? If not, perhaps you could indulge me with a question.
Absolutely.
Obviously, we're looking at your role in the context of local government this morning, and local authorities have a really wide range of functions, and many of them require experts across a whole range of these functions. I know that you do have a pool of expert advisors that advise you on a range of these functions, and I have seen decision letters that have come out where you have, for example, consulted with planning experts. But given the range of complaints that you have to deal with, and given that some of them will require you to examine things that are quite detailed and will require a degree of expertise, how does your own team, to what extent do they immerse themselves in those issues? To what extent do they have to have quite an in-depth understanding of, for example, planning, education or social work issues, and how do you train for and how do you cope with that?
We don't have specialist teams, we have general complaint handlers. We're very good at asking questions, actually. So you will get within the office, we have what communities of practice. If you're interested in a particular type of complaint, then we encourage learning development in those areas. So water complaints I won't even go into how complicated water complaints are. So we try and encourage self-development, if you like, but also some of our investigators come with particular skills from a sector. Now, whilst that's really important, it's equally important that we don't rely on that completely over the long term, because things change where if you're not in a job, you're not doing the CPD that goes with it, you don't necessarily know the nuances and detail of it, which is why our expert advisors are so important, because they have a fixed contract with us and they have to be qualified, they have to be practicing or have been practicing within the last 2 years. And it's not just about asking them for advice. Often we will chat with them and ask them for advice on how we need to ask the questions. In addition to that, we have a legal and policy officer who has a general understanding, will help with things. But I feel quite strongly that unless you were able to keep somebody completely well-trained and probably doing secondments and working in the field that they're doing, we're better off getting really expert at using our advisors.
So quite challenging, quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, and also we made a change to the way we issue our decisions. If we issue a public report, the organisation would always get sent a draft of it for comment on factual accuracy and general comment, basically. And we've started doing the same with decisions by letter. And what we found by doing that is our decision-making has always been sound. But what we found by sending out these provisional decisions is that the challenges that we might have had at the end, we were getting part-way through the investigation. And that's been hugely beneficial because it's been better outcomes, but often it's just been about the way we've explained stuff. And I think it's the terminology and the way we explain it that was often the issue. And every now and again, we do get a letter from a legal department saying you have misinterpreted this piece of legislation, and they're always really interesting conversations.
One question here.
Charles?
Thanks. Just building on that last point, actually, I was just wondering, given your sort of experience over time as SPSO, has there been a change in, and this can be specific to local government or not, a change in authorities' willingness to push back or desire to push back? And in particular, are there any sort of hot topics where you get into more arguments than otherwise?
I would say yes, there probably has been a willingness to push back, but I think it's been because of the change in process. What happened before is, and the majority of complaints get closed by letter. I was on the other side of the fence before I became SPSO, and you'd occasionally get a decision and think, oh, do you know what, it's just not worth it. Had I had a provisional decision, I'd have challenged something at that stage. And that's what we're seeing more of, is challenging when we send out our initial this is basically what we think the outcome is, and have you got any comments? And I think that's healthy, actually. I think that's a good thing, because it both challenges us, but it's ultimately about getting the best outcome for the complaint. And if the best outcome for the complaint and the complainer is everybody talking to each other, then I think that's fine. As to hot topics, I'd say for the local government, it's probably interpretation of social work legislation. It's probably the best place to leave it, that one. No, it's actually a subject that does come up a few times. And it's not just local authorities that challenge us more as well. We're finding sometimes, particularly with social work and health complaints, where you will have a practitioner or ex-practitioner making a complaint on behalf of a relative, where they themselves know the rules and the legislation. And we get quite a lot of challenge through that as well. So yes, I think it has increased, but I don't have an issue with it. I think it's good for us. I'd rather have that than people thinking, oh, do you know, it's not worth it.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think a good point to take away is that engagement at the interim stage. If you do have a difficulty or you want to push back on anything that's in the interim decision, take advantage of it.
Yeah, absolutely, because ultimately we all want the right answer, not the one we're each prepared to accept.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I hope
Thank you.
you're feeling better soon.
So I'll just set the front row seat.
Our second speaker this morning is Maureen Faulkner for the Information Commissioner's Office. I'm very interested to hear what Maureen has to say this morning. She's going to be talking about how the ICO regulates. Something that we have in common with local authorities, that we too are subject to data protection regulation. It's something we take very seriously. It can be quite tedious when that data protection policy pops up on your screen and you can't do any work until you've read it and ticked the box at the bottom. But I do know from personal experience that things can and do go wrong in any and every organisation, and where you've taken the time to be on top of the policy and know what to do when something goes wrong, in particular act quickly, it can make all the difference. It can be quite reassuring, so it is important to read these documents thoroughly.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for such a lovely breakfast. I just have to say that up front. It was really, really nice. So this is me. So much that Rosemary was saying there, obviously, as the face of the regulator. I'm sitting going, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And what I'm going to talk about today really is our regulatory action, which is obviously tied up with complaints and the kind of complaints that we get. And very much that notion of the I don't know, what can we call them, a serial complainant, the type of person who starts off engaging with a service or a public authority in some way and then ends up complaining about that public authority, then complaining to the regulator, then complaining about the regulator, so they go to the regulator, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think it's something that we see right across the board. So when complaints come to us, what I thought I'd talk to you today about is, what goes wrong and where. That's 72 hours, which when we all saw that, I think we all went, that's a bit hard. And then our response, big sticker carrot. And here I make an apology, because looking through the presentations, I see that big sticking carrot is going to be used later on in the presentation, but I swear we had no communication beforehand, so I'm not trying to steal any thunder in that regard. So, what goes wrong and where? So, I really did feel for you, Rosemary, when you were talking about the estimated uptake of complaints in terms of the Social Welfare Fund and how very many more complaints you had. When In the lead up to GDPR, we had the Department of Culture, Media and, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, or the Department of Fun, as we like to call it. And they estimated likely increased activity that the ICO would have as a result of the commencement of GDPR. And at that point, they estimated somewhere in the region of about an increase in 30 to 40%. In reality, it was closer to 80 to 90% increase in activity for us. So as an organisation, we have had to deal with a massive increase in inquiries, general inquiries from stakeholders, obviously in the lead up to GDPR. What was really interesting in that regard was the amount of particularly small businesses that contacted us to say, I understand that I've got to be registered under this new data protection legislation. How do I go about doing that? And we would say to them, so how long have you been in business? Oh, for about 10 years or something. We said, you realise it was a criminal offence not to be registered prior to this. This is something you've always had to do. And there were big, sharp intake of breath at the end of that. So, yeah, GDPR certainly did bring awareness to the fore, shall we say, for lots and lots of sectors in particular. But in terms of that greater activity that we then had, we went from an organisation that, when I started some 12 and a half years ago, had just under 300 members of staff. And currently, we are almost hitting 800. And that increase predominantly has happened in the past 2 years. The lead up to GDPR, because we had a moratorium on recruitment that came down from on high, and it wasn't until Elizabeth Denham went to basically the Treasury and said, I need more people, you need to give me more money because I'm not coping with what we have here, that we finally got the green light to be able to recruit. So you can imagine what that does to an organisation. Now, I say all of that in the lead up to what goes wrong and where, because some of you may have had, sadly, the cause to contact ICO via their helpline, perhaps talking to a caseworker, and perhaps getting some advice, perhaps being told something that you're thinking, that doesn't quite square, don't quite get that. And all I would say to you there is that bear in mind that a lot of the people that are answering the phone in their main helpline in Wilmslow are new to the organisation and are trying themselves to find their feet as to how things apply. And then stick into the mix that within Scotland in particular, local authorities are a completely different beast from those south of the border, and you already have in the mix potential for mixed messages, for information to come to you that's perhaps not just as relevant. And I would say to you, if that is the case, if you're getting something that you're kind of screwing your eyes up and thinking that's a bit odd, then please feel free to pick up the phone and call your local helpline in Scotland, which is the same as the main number, but it has a 5 at the end rather than a 3. So in terms of what goes wrong and what I want to talk about and what I want to bring to your attention is this notion of breach. What is a breach? Previously, in the old regime, a breach was a breach was a breach. It didn't, if it went wrong anywhere along the line, it was a breach in data protection terms. But under the new regime, we have 2 different kinds of breaches now. If we look at this notion of what constitutes a personal data breach, we look to Article 412 for the definition of that, and it's very, very specific as to what a personal data breach actually constitutes. And it has got to be something to do with security. So it's an issue, a breach of security that has led to either the accidental loss, destruction, etc. of personal data. So that doesn't cover every single breach anymore. A personal data breach is something that is very separate now to a general breach where perhaps it's a fair processing issue, where someone hasn't actually been told what's going to be happening with their information. Or perhaps it's an accuracy issue. These are not personal data breaches, so we have to first of all remember that there are 2 separate things going on here. In terms of complaints, when people do come to us to complain about an organisation infringing their rights, or if it is an actual personal data breach, then it's for the Information Commissioner herself to determine, A, whether she will investigate, and if she does, how that investigation will be taken forward. And that's about managing a lot of expectations. And I'm sure Rosemary has had to deal with this in all of the different roles that she's had, is managing the expectation of the complainant who, let's face it, wants you hung, drawn and quartered, and nothing else will suffice, but that there's a public humiliation of you in some way. And we have to kind of pull people back down off the ceiling and say to them, you know, let's get real here. That's not going to happen. This is the likely outcome, and why that's the likely outcome. What we have found in terms of breaches and complaints to us is that very often data protection is not the issue. I think Rosemary touched on this. Very often, it's just simply the weapon that they want to hit you over the head with, and that actually it's the organisation that they've got an issue with. It's not necessarily a data protection issue, really, that's at the heart of it. And we find that time and time again with complaints. It's what somebody referred to at a conference I was at on Wednesday. It's the weaponisation, which I thought was a fabulous term, the weaponisation of subject access requests or indeed complaints. So, breach reporting in 2018-19, and this, what I'm talking about here is personal data breaches, so it's that quite constrained. It's a breach of security that has led to accidental loss, etc. General business, that's where the most has come from. It'll come no surprise to see health there. Every time I put something like this up, I have to put a health warning on it to say that south of the border, any health breaches are mandatorily reported to us. That's not the case north of the border. The NHS is not mandated to report breaches to us. They do, don't get me wrong, they do. I'm not saying that all of those health statistics come from south of the border. Some will be north of the border, but just put a health warning on that itself, because it is very heavily skewed by the mandatory reporting south of the border. Local government's just sitting in the middle there somewhere. That local government, I think we have to, again, put a little bit of a health warning around because, as you may or may not know, education south of the border doesn't necessarily come under a local government remit, and each school south of the border is a data controller in their own right. Which makes it so much easier for us in Scotland to be able to engage with data controllers in terms of schools, because they come under generally the local authority. So again, another little bit of health warning on the education one there. In terms of actual reporting to us, I think this is a really scary figure, and I think it illustrates what I said to you at the outset about the activity increase that we've had since the introduction of GDPR. Now, we expected this. We did expect that, not perhaps to that extent, but we did expect that to rise because, as you know, you can be fined for not reporting the breach in time as well as the actual breach itself. So it's a bit of a double whammy there. So it stood to reason that most organisations were going to take the cautious approach and say, don't know whether we should report this or not, probably not, but we're going to do it anyway, just in case we get fined. So we are very well aware that there will be this rise. We're hoping it will plateau as people begin to report things to us, as we go back and give them feedback and say, actually, that's not a reportable breach. And then it will begin to fall as there's some kind of learning going on where people begin to say, right, I reported that and that wasn't reportable. So that's my bar now. Anything that I think is below that, I know I don't need to report, and so on and so forth as you begin to get used to this new regime. But again, what we're finding is people not understanding what a personal data breach, in inverted commas, actually is. And a lot of the reports that we get are actually not reportable breaches, in spite of the fact, as I say, it's escalated at a rate of knots. And I think this, hopefully, when you think about all the Daily Mail type headlines that we had at the lead up to the commencement of GDPR, I hope that this will give you some comfort, this particular slide, to say, well, what were the outcomes in relation to all those masses of reporting? And what we can see there, the vast majority, there was no action for the data controller to take. And I think that's quite comforting. I would hope anyway, that some of you would feel that. There might have been some action required on the part of the data controller, but in relation to the no action to take, I think, it's relatively small. We agree an action plan with some of them, but look at the civil monetary penalty. It's minuscule thus far. I'll just put in a wee caveat there, thus far. So I would hope that although you do have this big rise, and let's understand it, that I don't think since the 25th of May 2018 that there has been a tsunami of breaches that's caused that big rise in breach reporting. That's not the case at all. It's just this notion, I think, of people thinking we better report it. And I think this bears that out very definitely, that because there is no action for the DC, you'll see there that the main reasons, as I say, that I think is because predominantly people are reporting things that are not reportable or shouldn't be reported to us. But I think the other one is that very often you're taking mitigating action before you're even reporting it to us, or very soon thereafter, having reported it to us. So I think that's the other reason why there's so very little action required on the part of data controllers. And by and large, I think the public sector are very, very good at recognising where things go wrong and doing something about it very, very quickly. So we're down to the 72 hours. I'm always reminded of Flash Gordon, showing my age there. You've only got 48 hours to save the world, but you only get 72 hours to report to us. And that's not a very big time frame for you to ascertain whether or not it's a reportable breach. So let's just dig a little more into that. Is it really 72 hours from first being aware that there is a breach? So who thinks it's 72 hours from first being told something's happened? Very good, well done. Who thinks it's 72 hours, you've been told something's happened, now you've worked out, yes, it is a breach, very definitely. So is it 72 hours from there? At this point, nobody's going to put their hands up, because now you're all sitting there going, no, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that. Clearly not. No. You need to be able to investigate it. You might be told there's an issue, something's happened. You don't know if it's a breach. So you need time to go and find out, is this actually a breach? And that could be within 5 minutes, or that could be 5 days. Indeed, I can't imagine it, but it could be 5 months. I can't imagine why it would take that length of time. But the point is, you need to be able to go and investigate it and find out, is it actually a breach? It could be anything that's happened, but someone's just reported it as an incident. Or somebody may have said, there's been a breach, but when you actually investigate it, you think, actually, this is not a data protection breach at all. So you have to go and investigate it. Now you discover, yes, it is a breach. Absolutely. Does your 72 hours start at that point? Nobody's going to put their hand up again, are you? You're all frightened now to do it. No, it doesn't. What you now need to do, you have to work out, is this a reportable breach? So there's a breach and there's a reportable breach. And it's only a reportable breach if it is a personal data breach. So it's back to what I said, that it's about security. So it's a breach of security that has led to the accidental or indeed deliberate loss, destruction, etc. of personal information. That's the kind of breach that you need to think about. Is it reportable? So you've discovered that, yes, it is. It's a security breach that has led to the accidental loss or destruction of personal information. Does your 72 hours start then? Who thinks it does? Still nobody wanting to put their hands up. Well, no, because now you need to think, well, yeah, OK, it's a personal data breach. It is about security. It is about the accidental loss or destruction of personal information. But is there a risk to the individuals involved? Or is there something that was absolutely contained in-house and therefore the risk to the individual is actually minimal or minuscule even? And if you then determine that, yes, this is a personal data breach, and there is no risk, or the risk is very, very low, then that still would not be a reportable breach. What is reportable is where you've done all of your investigation and then you've identified the fact that it is a security issue, that there is now a risk to individuals in terms of their well-being, detriment, etc. And then, of course, if there's a high risk, then you have to be telling the individuals themselves, not just us as the regulator, but the individuals themselves. So, ticking clock. Hopefully what you're seeing there is that it's perhaps not quite as small a window as you might have first thought in terms of it being a reportable breach. Is that new to anybody in here? No, you're all quite okay with that. Good, because that just gives me a flavour of whether I need to keep saying this to people. Because actually at that conference I was at the beginning of the week, I had a stakeholder who came up and said to me, I'd been on the phone to somebody in Wilmslow, where our head office is, and they told me it's 72 hours from the breach happening. And again, I shook my head and I explained it's probably somebody that's new, that's on the end of the phone, hasn't quite picked up exactly what that's about. Please contact us if you're being given that kind of information so that we can then feed that back into the organisation. So now we're down to big sticker carrot. What kind of regulator are we? I'd like to think we're more of the carrot than the big stick. I'd like to think that we're an approachable regulator. And I would like to think that there's nobody in here that's frightened even to come to us and say to us, can I just run this past you? I had 2 phone calls like that yesterday from stakeholders. Can I just run this past? Can I just sense check this? And we are very, very happy for you to do that and to call the Edinburgh office in order to do that. But let's say the worst has happened. There has been a breach. There has been a personal data breach. You've reported it. What can you expect us to do in relation to that? And in order for you to be able to manage your expectations about what will happen, we have our regulatory action policy that you can look at. It's all very open. It sets out our powers there so that you can understand what powers we have, how we will use them. It helps us in terms of consistency. More importantly, I think it just ensures that fair and proportionate approach. And we are at pains to try to ensure that we have a proportionate approach and that our regulatory action befits the level of infringement, shall we say, that has taken place. Our regulation ensures that targeted, proportionate and effective. We are very much in the realms of ensuring that information rights are upheld. We want to see compliance, and that's what drives us. We're not driven by the fact that we can hit you over the head with a €20 million fine or whatever. That's not what drives us at all. To be honest, that is the very last thing that we want to happen, because in very many ways that shows a bit of a big failure on the part of the organisation, the sector, etc. We absolutely want more to be using that carrot. Come and talk to us, work with us. Please don't be thinking about this in terms of trying to hide from us or, yes, be afraid, be very afraid, because we can hit you with a big stick, but, try to get that into proportion. And what, as I say, what drives us is compliance. It's ensuring that information rights are being used, being upheld by that organisation and by that sector itself. Our initial consideration, so this is now we're at the point of trying to decide, right, something has happened here. It's been reported to us. We are now going to look at this as a formal complaint. How are we going to do that? And just to say to you that we do look at incidences on a case-by-case basis. There will come a point when we will begin to open that up more widely and look across maybe the sector or look across trends. But initially, we're looking at the case individually on its own merits and demerits. So it is being looked at on a case-by-case basis in terms of compliance breach. The seriousness of the breach obviously will determine where we go next. So we are looking here about, the nature of the information in question. We're looking at the willfulness. We're looking at the recklessness. I love that phrase because that speaks to, well, come on, you should have known better. So we will look at that in terms of seriousness. Novelty is a bit of an odd word, does it not, in relation to breaches? It doesn't quite sit nicely there, but sometimes some breaches are just so out the box that they do have a novel aspect to them, and I don't mean that in a light way in any way at all. And very often, if it is that, well, this really is something that is way above and beyond anything that we might have expected, that again will be taken into consideration. And that level of engagement, how open are you going to be with us? You know, did you come and report this yourself, or did we have to learn about this through the media, or because we've got 2 or 3 or even 20 or 30 individuals coming to complain about us or complain to us about a particular issue. So that engagement really does speak to how we will consider this at the outset. How open have you been? How willing are you to engage with us in trying to address the particular situation? And then finally, the opposite to the first one there, we will look at trends, not only within the organisation itself. So we will look and say, well, we will go back into our casework and we'll say, well, this particular council, how have they been with us over the years? Are they serial misdemeanours going on here that we've had to take issue with this particular organisation? Or is this a one-off, or do we not need to engage terribly much? And we will do that right across the office. So my colleagues in Milnesville will contact us if it's a Scottish data controller, and they will say, what's your engagement with that particular organisation? And we have had 1 or 2 that have gone back and said things like, we engage a lot with your office in Edinburgh. Oh, you know, we take advice from them constantly. And our colleagues will then come to us and say, is this right? Does this really happen? Have you advised them in this particular area? So, you know, we do check up on things, and we do try to verify whether or not what you're saying is actually fact. Okay, so it's going to go to a fine. And let's look at the categories. And what I want to bring to your attention here is we've got the upper tier one there, we have the lower tier, the figures for which you're well aware of. But please note where security is in that. It's in the lower tier, it's not in the upper tier. And very often, I think there's a bit of a skewed importance. Now, don't hear me saying security is not important, that's not what I'm saying. But sometimes there's a bit of a skewed importance in relation to security issues than there is in, for example, your lawful conditions or a breach of the principles themselves. But note where they are, they're in the upper tier. So I think we have seen in GDPR, I think, a very good skewing toward individuals' rights, toward fair processing, rather than what I think previously was a focus in security. And that security, very often the focus was about the technology, the technical fix. So long as we had the patching, so long as we've got the up-to-date all singing, all dancing, we'll be fine. And forgetting about the organisational issues that go on, the bits of paper that fly around car parks, or you know, the policy or the procedure that's not being updated, or the policy and procedure that is not being followed or hasn't been communicated. So I like the fact that it's done this. It really has focused us, I think, onto what I believe are the really important issues for individuals. And at the end of the day, that is what we're all about. We're all about trying to make it better for the individuals. Okay, so there's going to be a fine. How do we determine that? Do we just pluck it out of thin air and say, well, we don't like the cut of their jib, let's fine them a lot? Obviously, no, we don't do that. Otherwise, I think you might have cause to appeal that. But very definitely, the very first thing we will do is say, well, has there been any financial gain, or indeed, has there been any way in which perhaps there was a financial outlay that you've managed to avoid as a result of this particular breach? And if that's the case, that's the first element. That's the first thing that we will say. That level of financial gain is the starting point for us, or that level of avoidance in terms of finance is the starting line for us. We'll then look at the severity of it in terms of both the scale, the nature of the information, and more importantly, how long has this been going on? And then adding in aggravating factors and a deterrent effect. So it may well be that, you know, there have been lots of this similar breaches within your sector in this particular area, and you have the sad luck to be the next in line in that particular area, and that might be the trigger for us to say, do you know, we have taken regulatory action across the board on this particular issue in this particular sector. Now we need to make an example, and you don't want to be that one where that happens. And then, of course, we'll think about the mitigating factors, and that amount will then come down. So in a little bit more detail, as I said, we will look at the nature and the seriousness of the breach itself. So the level of information, I think we can safely say that if the breach involves special category data, it's there, it's in the serious box, very definitely. And I think you can then be thinking, this is likely to go to an administrative fine, very definitely. How long it's you know, been out there, as it were, how long the breach has actually been perpetrated, that will come into it as well. The number of individuals affected, now don't be thinking when you read that what we're talking about here, the more individuals that are affected, then the higher the fine. That's not necessarily the case. It could be the case, but it's not necessarily the case. It could be that the nature and seriousness of the data itself is such, but only one individual is affected, or a very small number of individuals are affected, and that could result in a fine. And that's because the seriousness, the nature of the information, the seriousness of that information is such that there's a major harm and detriment to that small amount of individuals. So, as I say, don't think when you read that it means, oh, the more that's affected. But you could well have lots of individuals that are affected, and the nature of the information is not special category data. It's just what we might term personal data, so it could be just name and address, telephone numbers, contact details. But the amount that's involved is such, and it's been going on for such a long time, that would take it into an administrative fine area. Very definitely, if this is an issue that's been plaguing you as an organisation and has just been one after another, then yeah, definitely that is something that we're then going to say, now hold on a minute. You know, this has been going on for so long, and we've said to you, you've had an undertaking with us, you've said we're going to put this in place to make sure it doesn't happen again, but it keeps on happening, then we need to do something. We need to take some kind of graver action in respect of that. And then what I've said already, the duration of the breach. How long has this been going on for? For some people, that is particularly bad when, for example, it's been something to do with the internet and perhaps potential access to personal information or special category data, where it's been in the public domain. It perhaps hasn't actually been accessed by anybody, but nevertheless it's been there for a long time before that has come to the attention of the data controller. And that's certainly something that we would again take into consideration. Again, looking at whether or not that organisation is representative of a sector or a particular group, then yes, we will take that into consideration. Where we think that there has been a risk here, that it's something that you ought to have known about, but perhaps you've made a decision that financially we can't afford to do anything about this, so it might be upgrading systems, etc., then we would look at that and say, well, hold on a wee minute. If we look at your turnover here and we think about some of your other spending, then we think perhaps this is something that you could easily have mitigated against because the cost, relatively speaking, is not as much as you seem to think it is. You've just simply not prioritised it. And that, again, would be an issue that we would look at. Public interest is a very, very big one, because very often we have made decisions not to take regulatory action because it's not in the public interest to do so. We are a creature of statute, as most regulators are, and therefore we have to be accountable to the public for our actions, for the finance that we use, the resources that we use in carrying out our regulatory function, and it just may well be that something is not in the public interest to pursue any further. That would definitely be the case, say, in the private sector, where an organisation has perhaps, it just doesn't have the resources, or it's even gone out of business. So there'd be absolutely no point in us taking regulatory action in those cases. And then, of course, we have these other ones where we're thinking about what other regulators have done in that particular space, and then express opinion of the European Data Protection Board. How that's going to look after Brexit, who knows? That's a bit of a movable feast. So these are very definitely the aggravating factors. So anything to do with this from a negative perspective is going to ensure that any level of fine is going to be at the upper brackets within the confines of the tiers. So think there also about, I've spoken about a lot of those already, but I want to just bring statutory codes of conduct to you, and also just this whole notion under the new regime of having a code of conduct. And I would encourage you, we are currently putting together our policy procedures about how we will actually use this new, I was going to say powers, it's not a power that we have necessarily, but it's an option for data controllers to consider whether they could put together a code of conduct. So it's not something that we do, it's something that the data controllers themselves have got to decide, yes, within this particular area, we believe that we could put together a code of conduct that could be monitored, regulated by an umbrella body. So you might, for example, allow COSLA within local authorities to regulate on this particular issue. So we have a code of conduct for our activity in this particular area. And that code of conduct can now come under this new data protection regime, and it can be approved by us. It's certainly something that we would encourage organisations to do, and to keep watching the ICO website to see when that's actually going live. We're looking to have that going live possibly by the end of the year, beginning of the new year. So not just things that we're going to provide you with in terms of statutory codes of conduct, but certainly things that you yourselves as organisations can be thinking about to help you in terms of your compliance. So I've spoken about the vast majority of that. I think that's probably as much as I want to say on that, and just leave it open for any questions.
Do we have any questions for Maureen this morning? Can we do the back?
Hi, Maureen. I just wanted to ask, obviously there are direct responsibility processors under GDPR, and I just wanted to ask to what extent you can actually see the playing field changing for them when it comes to what's coming across the ICO's desk. Are you in direct contact with processors, or is it really just controllers that are still the main entities that you're dealing with at the ICO?
I think, yes, controllers are the main entities that we are dealing with. I'm not sure how well processors understand their new responsibilities and liabilities under the new regime. Certainly the bigger ones will absolutely know that. Your big IT providers, etc., will be aware of that, I'm quite sure. But when it comes to the smaller processors, perhaps not just as aware, and possibly not be aware until as and when there is an actual breach, and suddenly they're faced with the fact, oh, this is now on us because, you know, the contract's in place, the data controller's done everything that could be reasonably expected of them, but it was down to the data processor. So, I mean, I would like to think as data controllers that it gives you some comfort, because it has always been an unfair position in my view, and it's not been something that we've been comfortable about, where we've had to take issue with the data controller, and it's not their fault. Basically everything was in place, but nevertheless that's where the liability lay under law. So, I mean, I think it will be, as time goes on and we begin to see data processors take into account, that's when we'll begin to see other processors sitting up and taking notice, very definitely.
Anyone else? Oh, it was me.
Shame.
I was actually at an event last week with the European Ombudsman, and we were looking at the impact of GDPR on us. And the first thing that struck me was there is huge inconsistency in what people are doing in different countries. One regulation no real consistency of practice. But one of the issues that came out for everybody was the concept of data protection by design. Mm-hmm. Because if you have data protection by design, presumably you have fewer breaches. I can give you an example of a data breach that we had. We used to issue our decision letters by writing a letter to the complainer and copying it to the public body. And it was only because it went, one particular letter went to a public body where the data protection officer knew me from when I was Information Commissioner and said, I'd like to report a data breach. You've written a lovely empathetic letter. You've told us about, talk to the complainer about their health problems, their debt problems. The trouble is, we didn't know any of this. But what it really made us think about was how we issue decisions. So we changed. We have a covering letter and we have an anonymised decision notice now. Do you give any advice, particularly if you're looking at breaches, of how organisations can build in more privacy by design? And is it something that you have any plans to regulate in a different way or oversee in a different way?
I think taking the latter first, I don't know that we have plans to regulate or oversee it in a different way. These things will always necessarily come out when, well, generally speaking, when an organisation does something wrong and it's brought to our attention, and then we go into the organisation to basically say, how did this happen? If we deem then that, for example, an IT system has been procured and installed without that privacy by design part of it, then that would be an element that we would look at. The difficulty we have at this stage, and I think this is something that can only happen as time goes on, is that we're dealing with so many, particularly in the public sector, so many ancient, not even historical, ancient systems that are not compliant, and we're fully aware of that. I don't believe, to be honest, that there is an organisation in the land that's fully compliant. There's going to be issues, and we understand that that's something that will happen over time. So what we are saying is, well, okay, your current systems cannot be by design, data protection by design, because they are ancient, but your new system should be. And that's where we would probably begin to bring that more to the fore. So when was this system installed? Was it installed in the lead up to or closely after GDPR being commenced? And if that's the case, well, you should have known better. There's a bit of recklessness going on there if you've procured something that is not fit for purpose. The difficulty you have, obviously, is you've got a salesman telling you that this is the best thing, it's all singing, all dancing, all buttons and bells, go faster stripes. And I mean, it's a bit like taking your car to the garage. You've just got to go with what they say, haven't you? It'll do everything you want it to do. And then once it's established and up and running, and you say, so how do I delete information because this person has now exercised their right of erasure? Oh, you can't. What do you mean I can't? And so in your procurement, what you must be doing now is thinking about data protection by design, particularly in relation to exercising rights of individuals. So it will become more and more part of our decision making in terms of our regulatory action. But it's not something, as I say, because thinking especially in public sector, it's not something that I feel we can hold you to account now over your historical systems.
Anyone else? Charles?
You had the stats up of breaches by sector. Within the local government stats, and the answer might be ancient systems, but is there any particular themes from the types of breaches being reported by local government?
Now, so that's interesting, because you immediately said systems, the ancient systems, and I would say to you that probably the vast majority of local government breaches are about bits of paper. It's not about systems, it's not about IT, it's about bits of paper being lost, it's about, I mean, let's face it, guys, if you are a practitioner, I'm not just going to pick on social work, in spite of the fact social work seems to dominate in this field, if you're a frontline practitioner and you're taking bits of paper out of the office in order to perhaps go to a hearing or whatever, and you leave it in your car overnight, that you are going to be burgled that night. That is going to be the night it's going to happen, isn't it? I mean, really, Sod's Law says that's when it's going to happen. It's never happened in your area before, but that's when it's going to happen. It's that perfect storm of circumstances. So it's back to the old stuff, really, to be honest. Get your policies and your procedures. That's been said throughout. Policies and procedures sound dry, they sound boring, but they are our blue blankets as employees, and they are organisations' blue blankets in terms of their responsibility and liability, so that people understand that if they are taking bits of paper, moving them, are they logging them in and out so that you know where they are? Are they being kept secure? Are they just, sitting in the boot of the car? You think, oh, put it in the boot of the car, that's fine. Or, where are they? Are they in the house? Who has access to them in the house? So yeah, it's about bits of paper, really.
But then you know why we're using bits of paper, because we have a good decent system.
Well, indeed. It's a bit of a catch-22, but yeah. As I said, people think it's all about the technical fix, and it's not really.
I just wonder, within Brodie's, if we've got concern that something has gone wrong, we can go to Martin Sloan, who's our data protection officer, and got the double benefit there of someone who is an information law specialist, and they can be sure we get the right advice. And he does very often, by the way, say that engagement with the ICO is quite an important thing, so he doesn't just rest on legal expertise. He will say this is something we have to talk to you about. So if something does go wrong, go to Martin and ask for advice, which doesn't kind of work like that. Martin is probably the tallest data protection officer in Scotland. I'm one of the shorter lawyers. So I ask Martin for advice, it's kind of Martin, this has happened. But do you get any sense that because people may be concerned about the outcome, or perhaps they're not as well informed as they might be, that there may be an element of under-reporting of data protection breaches?
I would say absolutely, and I think that's down to two things, to be honest. I think the two things are communication and trust. That's the two things that I think you need to consider. So first and foremost, if there's a breach anywhere in your organisation, do people know what to do? What are the communication channels so that people understand that you need to know about that breach as quickly as possible, because that clock is going to start ticking at some point and you can't be complacent about it. So that communication, I would say, in terms of breach reporting, you absolutely need to have some kind of, I don't know what you want to call them, data protection champions around the organisation, especially for local authorities, because you're such a disparate animal, and you're across different places, depending where you are. I'm thinking about Highlands and Islands. Oh my goodness, that's a nightmare in terms of the size. But you're across different buildings. You cover so much, as Rosemary said. The big difference between Scottish local authorities and others. So communication absolutely paramount, so that within each almost team, almost at that level, people understand that if there has been an incident, that they don't make a decision about it, that they report that to somebody else, who then knows who they should be reporting it to until it gets up to the tallest data protection officer in the land. And then the DPO makes a decision about that. But to get that communication requires trust, and trust on the part of employees and staff, so that they know that in the event that they've done something wrong, it's been an accident, it's not willful, it's not reckless, it's just one of those perfect storm issues, that they will not be hung, drawn and quartered as a result of that, because that's what stops the communication as well. So it's about getting the right culture, so that the trust is there, that people know that if I report this, then this is a good thing to do and not necessarily a bad thing for me, and I'm not going to be whipped within an inch of my life for having done this. Being able to hold your hand up and say either this is what I did, or more importantly sometimes this is what I nearly did, and learning from those near misses, it's vital. Near misses are just, that's meat and drink to you. If you get a near miss, then look upon that as something really positive, because it didn't actually happen, but it could have happened, and perhaps you can learn from that.
Thanks very much, Maureen.
You're welcome.
Very useful, helpful, practical advice. So we're just about to break for coffee. would just like to thank Maureen and Rosemary very much for coming along this one, especially you, Rosemary. You really should be home and in your bed.
I just went for the sympathy buzz.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with her. She's just come along here with a full cough this morning because she was in a room full of local government practitioners. So we're just about to break for coffee, which is served in the main room through the doors there. Could we aim to be back here in our seats for 11:30? Okay, well, so we'll just maybe kick off on the second part of this morning's event, where we have two Brody speakers for you, speaking on two very diverse subjects. So the first speaker we have is Neil McLean, who is in my team within Brody's. I just wanted to embarrass Neil by saying he's now been recognised as an associate to watch in the field of local government law by Chambers and Partners. I don't really know I'm that happy with that expression. Maybe I've got to keep a closer eye on you, is what it means. But I think it is actually a good thing. So Neil's going to be speaking about the Standards Commission for Scotland and looking at some recent developments.
Thanks, Jackie. So I am the speaker that's going to talk about carrots and sticks. And hearing Maureen speak reminded me about something that happened when I was a trainee, when I was on a conference call and I was in the employment department, and somebody on the call kept saying, "What are the carrots? What are the carrots in this?" And I hung up the phone deeply confused, because our client didn't own a farm or harvest carrots of any description. It was only later on that I worked out that that's the lingo for incentives. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the role of the Commission and about the Councillor's Code of Conduct, which will be familiar to most of you. But really what I want to talk today about is a recent decision from the Sheriff Appeal Court, or the Sheriff Principal, about a Standards Commission decision, and then just some trends that we are seeing within professional regulation that might end up finding their way to the conduct of elected members. So what is the Standards Commission for Scotland? Well, it's an independent public body responsible for encouraging high standards of behaviour by councillors and those appointed to boards of devolved public bodies. It was created by the Ethical Standards in Public Life Scotland Act 2000. The role of the Standards Commission is twofold, of course. It's to encourage high ethical standards in public life, including the promotion of its codes of conduct, and to issue guidance to councils and devolved public bodies. And it's also to adjudicate on alleged breaches of the codes of conduct, and where breaches are found, to apply sanctions. There is the carrot, so my thanks to the Brody's graphics department for that, or Ewan, as he's also known, our trainee. So this is about the incentives that the Standards Commission hopes to encourage local authorities to behave better. So to encourage high ethical standards in public life, of course, is its promotion function. And it fills that by producing a wide range of guidance and other supporting material to public bodies. That includes model codes of conduct and guidance on the code itself. And all of that material can be found on the Commission's website, which is helpful, user-friendly, and I encourage you to look there if you've not already. So that's the good part. There is the stick again. Thanks to the Brody's graphics department for the stick. I don't have any stories as a trainee about sticks working in a progressive modern law firm. So the enforcement arm of the Commission, of course, is to adjudicate on alleged breaches of the codes of conduct and where the breach is found, to apply a sanction. What happens is that the Commissioner has a duty to investigate and report on alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct, so submits a report to the Standards Commission. It then establishes a panel to decide upon the allegation itself. What will also happen, of course, is that the panel will adjudicate on alleged breaches of the Code using a hearing procedure, and all sorts of information about the procedure can be found again in the 2000 Act if you're interested in looking there. There are 4 sanctions that apply when a breach is established. And what's important to note is there's no discretion about applying a sanction. Once the Commission establishes that a breach has occurred, what the Act says is that it must apply a sanction. So it must do one of these 4 things. The least punitive, of course, is the decision to censure a councillor, which essentially means that the elected member is given a formal warning about the breach. More serious is that the elected member can be suspended for up to a year from attending one or more meetings or from attending all meetings of the council. And of course, more serious of all is the requirement to the ability rather to disqualify a councillor for up to a period of 5 years. Disqualification will have the effect of vacating that councillor's office, as well as terminating their membership of any committee or subcommittee of the council. So clearly, aside from the obvious, which is that any investigation by the Standards Commission is going to take up a lot of time and resource for the council and for the elected member, it's also going to have an effect on that elected member's ability to conduct council business. That would obviously clearly be the case if they were suspended from attending any board meetings or any committee meetings or council meetings. But also, any censure is likely to have the impact of lessening the public's confidence in that elected member, and in particular the ability to carry out their roles and responsibilities. So clearly, investigations by the Standards Commission are something that should be avoided. And I see some shakes of the head around the room, but whether that actually is a message that lands with the elected members themselves, of course, is an entirely different discussion. I think this slide is quite subversive in that we're at a local government conference, and yet in the bottom right corner I've put plus all 32 local authorities. But the serious point of this is I wanted to really demonstrate the reach of the Commission itself. So it covers a whole range of public bodies. So in the top left we've got individual public bodies, including SQA, SEPA are also in that list, Scottish Water, further education colleges, and the top right, National Health Service boards and regional transport partnerships. I won't say too much about transport because James is going to talk about that very shortly.
Did June do that slide for you too?
Yes, and once again, I'll attribute this slide to Ewan, who deserves all the plaudits for the images here. So, of course, what we're talking about is the Councillors' Code of Conduct, which was approved by the Scottish Parliament and applies to all 1,227 elected members in Scotland's local authorities. It has nine general principles which are overarching. I'm not going to go through each of the principles. I'm going to just pick out three because they are relevant to what I'm going to say later on about key trends. So one of which is duty. So as an elected member, they have a duty to uphold the law and act in accordance with the law and the public trust placed in you. In terms of accountability and stewardship, an elected member is accountable to the public for the decisions and action they take, and you have a duty to consider issues on their merits, taking account of the views of others, and ensure that the council uses its resources prudently in accordance with the law. And finally, on respect, elected members must respect all other councillors, all council employees and the role they play, treating them with courtesy at all times. Similarly, they must respect members of the public. So these overarching principles are to be applied in what is described also as informal dealings with council employees, party political groups and others. And I think that "and others" is the important bit when we come to look at what may happen in future with elected members. And those principles to be applied no less scrupulously than at formal meetings of the council and subcommittees and committees as they are in informal dealings. So those are the overarching principles of the code. In a bit more detail, and again, there's helpful guidance on all of these things, and I don't intend to take you through them all this morning. So it's split into different parts. You've got a part of the code on general conduct, which has that section on informal dealings I've just talked about. It talks about the very important part, which is relationships with council employees and treating them with respect. There's also provision on bullying and harassment, and that's a priority for the Scottish Government and the UK Government as well. And that wording came in to the code in 2018, and a similar provision is in the ministerial codes, both north and south of the border. And then there are also parts of the code that deal with financial interests, so registration of interest, declaration of interest at meetings, and also in decision-making in a quasi-judicial or regulatory function, and helpful annexes to the code about those issues too. We're coming on to the two main things I really wanted to speak about this morning. I'm starting first with the first ever appeal against a decision of the Standards Commission. So the factual background here is that Councillor McDermott is a councillor in Fife and was alleged to have made inappropriate remarks to a taxi driver, WH, at the Council's Regulation and Licensing Committee. What he is alleged to have said during the course of that meeting, which was described by a sheriff in later proceedings as fractious and oppressive, he's alleged to have said, "I don't understand why two women would live with you, never mind get married to you. I think this man is a bully, and I don't want bullies driving people around in taxis in Fife." The latter of which, of course, very noble aim, but not a good thing to say, I would suggest, in a meeting of a Regulations and a Licensing Subcommittee. So the licence application was refused. WH appealed to the sheriff. There was a proof before the sheriff on what happened at the licensing hearing. Within that, the sheriff found that Councillor McDermott was alleged to have said the things that he did. Sorry, he said the things he was alleged to have said. The appeal was upheld. After that, WH then, on the back of a successful appeal against his refusal of his licence, then complains to the Standards Commission about the behaviour of the elected member. And the Standards Commission also fined against the elected member. So in doing so, and this is helpful for people in the room, what the Standards Commission relied very heavily on was contemporaneous notes of the committee meeting, both that had been prepared by the committee administrator and also by the solicitor who was taking part in the committee proceedings. I've advised the council committee, I know how difficult it is to keep the elected members focused and keep an accurate record of what they are saying in the meeting. But I think the sheriff in this case was very impressed, as were the panel, about how accurate those notes were in terms of recording basically stage by stage what was happening in the room. The appellant's response to being presented with these contemporaneous handwritten notes was to simply say that he could not recall whether he had said the things he was alleged to, but he wasn't disputing the fact that if the committee administrator and solicitor had noted it, then there was at least the prospect that he may have said something like those things, which a classic denial, non-denial from the elected member. So the panel found that there had been a breach. And then it went on to consider whether, in finding a breach, there were any other rights that might be engaged by for the elected member. And what they had in mind in particular was Article 10 of the Convention on Human Rights and the right to free speech. And the test that applies in this situation for when you're considering whether a breach has occurred in this context is, has there been a breach of the councillor's code of conduct? So in this case, the panel said yes, because the statement that was made by the elected member was in a quasi-judicial function, but it wasn't about the hearing. It was a personal attack on WH. So there'd been a breach of the code, looking at the provisions on respect and also the provisions on conducting hearings fairly. Does that mean that there's been a breach of Article 10? So you then look to the fact that this is an elected member, political speech is protected. Has there been a breach because you're saying that you're about to interfere with his Article 10 rights? They said yes to that, so they recognised that Article 10 was engaged. The next question they asked themselves, well, if Article 10 is engaged, this elected member has rights of political speech, is what we're about to do by way of sanction justified? Is there a less restrictive way we could approach this exercise? What they did is they weighed up all the aggravating, mitigating factors that were put forward and decided that ultimately the decision here to suspend the elected member for 2 months was justified, weighing up all of those factors. DD appeals against the decision of the panel of the Standards Commission, and his appeal was unsuccessful. And it's an interesting decision, and I'd commend you to read it, because the Sheriff Principal who heard the case goes through the statutory framework and the submissions that were made by both parties, and really analyses the issues in quite a succinct and helpful way. The Standards Commission have published the decision on their website. I think they're quite rightly proud of the approach that they took to the hearing itself, and the Sheriff Principal found entirely in their favour. There was essentially two grounds of appeal. The first was that the Commission had erred in law in their assessment of the facts, and in particular what they had done is they had failed to make appropriate findings in fact. So there was at least some doubt still as to the exact words that were used by the elected member, and the appellant was critical of the fact that it hadn't been proved with sufficient detail that he had said exactly what he was accused of saying. And the second ground of appeal was in relation to freedom of speech. So the argument being that this was an elected member exercising a quasi-judicial capacity, that you should be very, very slow to interfere with the right to free speech in that situation, because then you would stymie decision-making. And what the Sheriff Principal said that there would be no error in law in the panel's approach. He described the panel's approach as being meticulous when it came to how they had assessed the evidence. And it comes across quite clearly in the decision. What the panel had before it was the contemporaneous notes that I've referred to already. It had, those notes had been converted into typed notes. It had other extraneous evidence before it. And you can clearly see that, based on what the Sheriff Principal says, that the panel has actually sat down and analysed that evidence in a thorough way and reached a finding, in fact, on the balance of probabilities, the finding being that the elected member had said what he was alleged to have said. You can also see from that decision that the panel had carefully analysed the Article 10 issues and applied the test which I've just described. And again, the Sheriff Principal said that there could be no flaw in what they'd done in relation to Article 10. They'd identified the right legal test, they'd applied it, and in particular, they'd taken care at the sanction stage to ensure that the sanction was not more punitive than it ought to have been, including doing things like looking at the Commission's own guidance on sanction, working through that, looking at what were aggravating factors in relation to a more punitive sanction and what were mitigating factors that meant the sanction ought not to be as severe. And all the sort of usual things you would expect to see in there. On the mitigation side, that the councillor had an otherwise unblemished record. On the aggravating side, that this was in a public meeting, it was a personal attack on a member of the public. So again, interesting decision to read, and what it does, I think, to take away in a legal sense, is that when politicians act in a quasi-judicial capacity, the enhanced protection rights afforded them to make political comment are less likely to be engaged, particularly when they're saying things which are not directly relevant to the hearing or which are of a personal nature like this. So moving on then to key trends and what we're seeing elsewhere. First is the distinction between professional behaviour and private behaviour. The medical regulators have long recognised that they can regulate their practitioners for things that they do in their private lives. That's well established. What we're seeing is that trend moving into other areas of regulation where that traditionally wasn't the case. So the solicitor profession is one. Whilst there have been cases in the past where solicitors have been regulated for things they've done in their private life, it was not anywhere near as common as it was in the medical professions. And you may have followed the case this year involving the partner at Freshfields, who was found to have abused his position of trust and power by engaging in sexual misconduct with a more junior employee. And he was found by the regulator to have failed to act with integrity and in the manner that the public expects of the profession. So if we go back to what I said at the outset about the councillor's code of conduct, the informal dealing section is clear that it applies to others. And whilst a lot of the code is framed on the basis of elected members acting in their capacity as councillors, it seems to me that there's at least the possibility that what we will see is the Standards Commission starting to look at conduct that happens in an elected member's private life to the extent that that exists. And social media is one such area where I think that might come into develop. I did have a look at the Standards Commission's statistics. What I was interested in is how long does it take on average to resolve a complaint? And the stats look excellent. 10.5 weeks to resolve a complaint. And what I'm about to say is not a criticism of the Standards Commission. It can only do what it can with the resources that it has. But what those statistics don't include, of course, is the period in which the Commissioner is investigating before the report gets to the panel to take a decision. So what you have is 10.5 weeks from the decision coming in that there's going to be a hearing and the hearing itself and the determination, which is good. But if we take the case of WH, so his initial complaint was made on the 12th of August 2017. The Commissioner referred it on the 6th of March 2018, and then the decision took place on the 25th of April 2018. So you got 8 months from start to finish. And why is that important? Well, that's important because the single biggest issue that we see at the moment is behaviour on social media. So another part of my practice, along with local government, is giving advice on defamation and reputation management, including to local authority clients. And social media is dominating the issues that are coming to us for advice on. The reason being is so much damage can be done so quickly to reputations on social media. And what we see in particular is, when it comes to elected members, using social media to say things about the behaviour of the council or officers within the council, and then that post remaining there for a long period of time. So your option is you approach the social media platform and ask them to engage their takedown procedures. They will only do that in the most extreme cases. So if something is clearly very offensive indeed, you approach the elected member and try and persuade them to take it down, and they may feel that they want to maintain it because it's a valid criticism of a person or something the council has done. Or you go to the Standards Commission and complain about the fact that this post is there. And all I would do, I suppose, by closing is to pose the question is whether that is going to be an effective way of dealing with complaints in the modern age when something is in social media. Because if it takes 8 months from start to finish and you have a social media post which an elected member refuses to take down, then there's 8 months where that post is sitting there criticising officers. And certainly one of the things that Jackie and I have given a lot of advice about to local authorities is a situation where that criticism is not about the chief executive of the council, it's not about a senior post holder, it's about an officer who isn't expected to be criticised in public in that way. And that's a very challenging situation indeed. So I suppose it's certainly something to think about when you're considering reporting these issues. And I wonder whether in the future there might be a quicker way to resolve these things other than sort of an 8-month full hearing. So that's all I wanted to say. I mean, we have time for questions at the end of Jamie and I's presentation. Happy to take any now if that breaks it up.
Maybe just a personal observation. The SRA has been quite clear that with regard to the regulation of the legal profession in England, that it is going to be looking more closely and it will consider the conduct of solicitors in their private lives in the context of regulated proceedings. We are aware that the Law Society in Scotland is considering this particular issue at the moment, and I think that we anticipate that in the not too distant future they will be changing the conduct rules to accommodate that type of change. I'm not suggesting for one moment that if you want to have a big blowout, this is a weekend to do it, but just bear in mind that the position is going to change. And just going back to the question of member regulation, I can recall when the Standards Commission was first established, and we had a situation when I was the monitoring officer at Clerk Manager Council where two councillors cross-referred one another, which is not that uncommon. The Provost complained about the Leader of the Opposition disrespecting his role as the chair at the council meeting, and the Leader of the Opposition reported the Provost for being oppressive in the council chamber. So I had the unfortunate experience of two investigating officers coming out to see me and chatting through how they were going to carry out their investigation. But what I recall most was that they referred several times to the fact that I was one of the first, you were one of the first councils we've had to come out and see about alleged breaches of the Councillors' Code. And how does that make you feel as a monitoring officer? They left me feeling like an unfit mother at the end of the day. Thankfully, all was resolved, and both of them got just a slight rap on the knuckles, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it did much to improve the behaviour of either member in the council chamber afterwards. We did tend to have that friction just continuing for quite some time. But it was a very salutary experience for me as a monitoring officer.
One of the social media case is quite an interesting one, but I think one point I would maybe make is, how do you sort of marry up the private life and the professional life? Because what people do in their private life doesn't always necessarily have an effect on their professional life. And my question would be, how far do you look at that? What constitutes as having an effect on the professional life? But then you could also argue people do have a right to privacy in their private life, and there has been cases over the years that would show that, whether it be media or what have you, will try and slander a person's reputation, albeit that's their personal life, it's not their professional life. Yeah. To me, they are two different things. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that you do need to be careful when you're in certain positions of power, but I do also think there is a balance that needs to be struck as well.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely right. And it's certainly something that the regulators have struggled with. The approach that tends to be taken is that if it's something incredibly serious, so if we take the example of the Freshfields partner, that was sexual misconduct, and a very, very serious allegation was made there, although no finding was made as to whether the more junior solicitor had consented to what happened or not. They were very careful to not make a decision on that. So the more serious the allegation, the more likely it is that a regulator feels it's able to intrude on somebody's private life. The less serious the allegation, the less likely they are to intrude. So one of the things that I have done in the past is acted as a presenting officer for the General Teaching Council for Scotland, so prosecuting teachers. And I would see all of the investigating committee reports, and I would see the investigating committee struggling with this idea of, well, what's actually this person's private life? And what they would tend to do is just take the approach that I've outlined. So if it was a road traffic offence, for example, which had to be reported because it was a conviction, it's unlikely that that's going to lead to regulatory action. If it's a serious drugs offence, then it's likely that will be reported. And what it really comes down to is, for most regulators, is would the public's trust in the profession overall be undermined if that person was allowed to practice? And that tends to be the way that they look at it. So I suppose in this context it would be, would the public's trust in elected members be undermined if this person was allowed to represent the views of their ward, I suppose.
Neil, I was just going to make a sort of couple of observations more, and I think the 5 case is important in providing a bit of check and balance around the human rights argument, because when that sort of first probably came to prominence around a case, for instance, involving 2 members from Edinburgh Council, right, was that it really felt like it was, the doors had been blown off the thing, because actually that argument gets now portrayed the whole time as a happy medium. And actually what you then find, and come back to your point about more junior officers, that it's open season on senior officers now, arguably, as well. And actually what the code does, or what it doesn't do, is provide any comfort or any real protection for senior officers in a very difficult, febrile political atmosphere. And with isn't it all authorities in terms of coalitions or minorities around the country now, that makes it an even more challenging environment within which to work. And actually the fact that there is now a statement in the code saying that bullying, and I forget what the other phrase is a breach of the code, actually is a great thing there to help protect people going forward, because what the Commissioner also doesn't do, or finds it hard to look at, is a consistent pattern of behaviour where each instance of itself is below the threshold, because we have to remember that a lot of members are very experienced in their dealings, and actually that can be so disruptive and corrosive to an organisation that actually, if they're not able to look at things across a period of time and consistent behaviours, it makes it very, very hard for senior officers in terms of the council and behaviours. So I suppose it's more just an observation or comment, but yeah. No, that's
So I mean, on your first point, the code, I think, really just reflects what the law of defamation says, which is that the more senior you are in an organisation, the more prominent you are as a public figure, the more robust you have to be to criticism of what you do. And I think that you're right. I mean, the additions to the code about bullying and harassment are incredibly helpful. And I think strengthening up the provisions as well that deal with respect would also help, because where even the most senior officials are not immune from feeling the sting of the criticism that's made of them, particularly if, as you say, it's a course of conduct. And that's where the harassment part comes in. Again, I think that addition to the code is going to be quite helpful, because harassment, of course, is about a course of conduct. It explicitly recognises that small, minor incidents taken together can amount to harassment of an individual. So absolutely agree with the comments you've made on that. Okay, thank you very much.
Our final speaker this morning is Jamie Dunn, who's a senior solicitor in the Government Regulation and Competition team in Brodie's, working alongside Neil and myself. He's going to be speaking about the Transport Scotland Bill. I'm particularly interested to hear what he has to say in and around bus regulation. It's an area where we have advised a number of local authorities in the past, and most of the advice has been about things they can't do, which can be a bit depressing, but the Act certainly opens up new opportunities for local authorities to be doing things that previously they couldn't do, and maybe moving forward in terms of commercialisation.
Yep. Just make sure I know how this works. Yes. Okay, so first thing I suppose to preempt this with is that with the benefit of hindsight, it presented a great opportunity to go to town with clip art that unfortunately I didn't take up. But lesson learned from Neil, next time I will get Ewan to help out with the slides. Second point to say is that I will be referring to this throughout as the Transport Scotland Bill. It did pass stage 3 on the 10th of October, so we're now just in that 4-week period before Royal Assent. So it will be, in the due passage of time, the Transport Scotland Act 2019. So, it's not quite an omnibus bill, forgive the attempt at a pun. It covers a lot of areas. They are all united by having some connection to either transport or promotion of active travel and regulation in that sense. One of the biggest bits of fanfare for this has been the introduction of a power to introduce low emission zones. In many senses, what the Transport Scotland Act, as it will be, will do is empower local government to do things, subject to some quite severe limitations at points by regulations to follow. But it's about options. It's not mandating things that local government will have to take up, but it's providing options to do things in the future. So low emission zones being the first one. Bit of policy context to this. Obviously, there's a lot in the news at the moment about climate change and the like, and you'll be aware of some of the issues that certain councils, including in Scotland and further afield, have had with air quality standards and meeting air quality standards. I had a very quick look at the latest stats that Friends of the Earth Scotland have on this, and we have 38 official pollution zones across Scotland where air quality levels are considered unsafe, and there are 6 streets that breach legally binding limits for air particles. Hope Street in Glasgow being the most polluted street in Scotland, certainly as of yesterday, and this creates difficulties both for the Scottish Government, the UK Government indeed, and councils, because there can be quite severe fines and also potential for civil action for these, for breaching these. So low emission zones are an attempt to deal with that policy context. So how does this emission zone work? Well, the bill gives, and the Act gives local authorities the power to make or modify a low emission zone scheme, designating an area which can either be the whole local authority area or one or more areas within the local authority area as a low emission zone. There are ancillary powers to introduce cameras in order to see who's coming in and leaving the zone. There's also, I wanted to flag this, a power to suspend the scheme for up to 7 days. Now, when that was originally introduced in the bill, it was only for nationally important events. But the Act as passed does allow local authorities to suspend these schemes for significant local events as well. So if there's something that maybe doesn't rise to the level of the Mod or the Edinburgh Festival, it's still possible to suspend the scheme in order to allow people to drive to these events. The legislation does impose certain requirements in relation to grace periods on local authorities. So from when the zone is introduced, the local authority has to pick a grace period which will be applicable to non-residents of the zone, so not the local authority, of the specific zone, and one applicable to residents. The non-resident period has to last for at least 1 year after the zone is brought in, but can't carry on for more than 4 years. The residents one is quite interesting. Intriguingly, the way that it was amended during passage, there's no requirement for a grace period for residents anymore. If you do have a grace zone for residents, it can last up to an additional 2 years. But unlike the bill as originally introduced, it's not a requirement. Whether that is considered not really a big risk because councils are less likely to impose these things on the voters is perhaps its own barrier to that. But it is worth noting that. So, how does it work? The bill prohibits driving a vehicle into a low emission zone unless it meets specified emission standards. Now, how do you know that a vehicle has driven to the zone? Well, the bill requires it to be proven on an approved device. Now, essentially that's a camera. This is ANPR based system. It is not going to be enforced by parking attendants taking photos of cars. It can't be enforced by parking attendants taking photos of cars within the zone. ANPR cameras, which the bill provides for, can track people entering and exiting. Whether a vehicle does breach those standards or not, the bill says has to be proven by a record obtained from the Secretary of State, but it doesn't say where the presumption lies. So do you presume that a car is polluting unless the record proves otherwise, or vice versa? I expect that is something that's going to be set out in what will probably be quite elaborate regulations that follow on from this. And I've just listed there, and it's on your slides, the various things that the regulations will mandate for how these penalty charges are going to work in practice. But there's a lot of detail still to be bottomed out, is the message. Vehicles or individual classes of vehicles can be exempted by either the local authority. Those exemptions can be for up to a year, or under the regulations, which will have to be done by the Scottish ministers, which aren't limited. It's worth noting the money raised from charging people to enter low emission zones can only be used to facilitate the achievement of scheme objectives. Now, as the Scottish Government, the introductory speech in the Scottish Parliament laid out, what that essentially is saying is when you draw up the scheme, and when you draw up one of these schemes, you do have to set out a list of objectives. What the Scottish Government expects local authorities to put in these things is what they want to see out of it. So if you take the City of Edinburgh Council proposed scheme, which is still in a very sort of embryonic stage, part of that is about saying, well, we are creating a zone within the city centre that will have fewer cars, it will be less polluted, we want to encourage active travel, we want to have more sort of events filling, streets that work for pedestrians, etc., etc. The Scottish Government is basically saying, can you list all of those in your scheme, and then you will be entitled to use the proceeds of the scheme in order to pay for those things. But it's just that little bit of ring fencing to say, this is about improving these areas and the quality of the environment. And again, various ancillary powers for expenditure to operate it. Scottish ministers can give people grants to bring their cars up to scratch. or potentially replace them. I don't really see the grants being that big, but we'll see. Can also lend money to local authorities to pay to install the cameras and so forth. And there's actually a quite interesting point that the only thing that you may do as a local authority with the money you raise, other than pay for the objectives of the scheme, is repay the Scottish ministers for anything that they've given you. So made sure they got that one in there. You need Scottish Government approval to make, amend or revoke a scheme, so any of those changes, plus requirement to consult these various bodies. The key mandatory ones here are SEPA, SNH and Historic Environment Scotland. The other requirements here are much the same as you will probably be used to if you've ever gone through a traffic regulation order consultation process. The road users that are potentially affected by any change to traffic regulation. And so, it's fairly common sense. And I've just added at the bottom there, you might have a public inquiry on these things as well. The regulations will also spell out various other things that the scheme is going to have to do, but there are some requirements in the Act, and for example, the scheme's objectives have to be set out in the scheme. They have to contribute towards meeting air quality, well, shock horror. So, bus services. Jackie's particular interest in what I'm going to say today. What this does is it amends the Transport Act 1985. Now, some of you will be horrifyingly familiar with this. Section 66 banned councils from running their own bus services. There were exemptions for certain island councils and for any council that was already running a service when the ban came into effect, which is why Lothian Buses has been running in the interim. But essentially what the 1985 Act did was it stopped local authorities from creating new bus companies. What the bill as introduced was going to do was create an exemption for local authorities to run bus services to meet a public transport requirement that they considered necessary, i.e. people in that area of town are not getting served by private bus companies. We are going to operate a service to serve them ourselves. The concern is, or was, obviously, that what that meant was local authorities can only run loss-making bus services, will leave all of the profitable ones to private companies, but of course, local authorities being not quite awash with cash, were not going to be very likely to do that. So, as passed, the bill simply repeals the ban. There is a positive power to provide local bus services if the local authority is satisfied that the provision of the service will contribute to the implementation of relevant general policies, i.e. it's quite a low bar. It's not the necessity test that was originally there. If you think that it will benefit the people in your local area, then there is a positive power to provide bus services, as the bill went through. Bus service improvement partnerships. Essentially, this is an incremental a little bit more of an incremental change to what were bus quality partnerships. In their new guise, essentially the difference is that local authorities can impose greater service standards and also provide, in exchange for companies signing up to these improvement partnerships, whereas the quality partnerships said that local authorities had to provide facilities, so think park and rides and bus gates and physical infrastructure. What the local authority can now do as part of a scheme is provide measures. So that could be as simple as we're going to restrict parking on certain roads to make them clearer for buses. It might mean restricted routes and the like, but not necessarily the creation of expensive infrastructure, essentially. Franchising, so this is a change, again, a little bit incremental, but it's moving forward from the position under the Transport Scotland Act 2001. There is no longer a necessity test connected to local authority policies, so it no longer needs to be necessary to introduce franchising to implement your policies when it comes to bus transport. It's enough to demonstrate that it will contribute towards them. But essentially, what the what the bill attempts to do is make it easier to set up a franchising model than the 2001 Act did. It was perceived that the 2001 Act made it too difficult to introduce franchising. It imposed too high a bar on when franchising was an option. So a local authority can now say, either for their whole area or in specific areas, we will only allow bus services here if they are under a franchise agreement. And what that means is we will say what services you will provide, what standards you will provide them to, and what facilities you will put on the side. That has to be signed off by the Traffic Commissioner for Scotland, just to essentially make sure that they are happy that the service that is going to be provided under that franchising proposal is one that they are happy with, but rather than the Scottish ministers, but essentially it is a more palatable option, the government hopes, for local authorities to introduce franchising for bus services in their local areas. Smart ticketing. Again, this was already something, the groundwork for which was laid in 2001 under the Transport Scotland Act. What that did was introduce the foundation for saying, well, we are going to introduce one national Scottish smart card or one Edinburgh smart card or Glasgow smart card that will get you on all of these services, including, just for the avoidance of doubt, the subway and a ferry and so on. The idea was to link up transport. Given the amount of time that has passed since 2001, during which these schemes have not taken off, 2019 was seen as the perfect opportunity to introduce the groundwork for creating smart tickets. If we're going to have national standard tickets, we can have national standard smart tickets. What is a smart ticket? Well, it's essentially just one that can be provided in electronic format. So, here's the ticket on my phone type situation. There will be national standards, and this is just laying the groundwork for that. After those national standards are set, it will be a requirement to follow them. Now, this hasn't been at all controversial. Workplace parking charges. This was introduced to the bill during passage. You will be aware as part of a deal between the Scottish Government and the Scottish Green Party on the budget. This gives a local authority the power, and again, much as with all the ones I've been talking about so far, it is a power to do something, and it is not mandating that this must be done. It is a power of the local authority to make a workplace parking licensing scheme if you have a local transport strategy and if you consider that the scheme will facilitate the achievement of the policy set out in that strategy. How that works is you can require a person to hold a licence in order to provide workplace parking places. Now, this scheme can either apply to the whole local authority area, or it can apply again to certain parts of an area. So you might decide that you want to discourage parking in the city centre or town centres where bus services or other forms of public transport are good, but still allow people to use their car for out-of-town areas. That is allowed for. It is for the local authority to determine the extent of any scheme, but essentially any employer who provides parking places to their employees within that area would be required under such a scheme to hold a licence and would be charged for that licence on the basis of how many spaces they provided. So what's up to the local authority? Well, I've just listed there the various things that local authority gets to decide, but essentially, as I say, the area, who's covered, who's exempted, and how the licences work. What the charges are going to be for them. But before you bring it in, a duty to consult, well, par for the course really for anything that you're going to do. An impact assessment, further rules that will be imposed under regulations by the Scottish ministers. Again, this, like some of the other areas, there are details to be bottomed out post-royal assent. There are required national exemptions for persons with disabled badges, and there are required exemptions for staff places, bearing in mind that this is about workplace parking, so it's about staff parking, for staff places at qualifying NHS premises, i.e. NHS hospitals will not be required to charge their staff to park. And also hospices. That was one that was added during passage. essentially as a, oops, we forgot that they aren't qualifying NHS premises, but it's the same type of concern. Proceeds can only be applied for facilitating the achievement of policies in the local transport strategy. So again, you're getting money out of this, spend it on active travel, spend it on park and ride, spend it on promoting public transport, etc. And then finally, pavement parking, which is a bit of a bête noire of mine. This is the fourth attempt that there has been in the Scottish Parliament to ban pavement parking. It's worth noting that actually obstructing any highway, including a pavement, is actually prohibited, but it's not enforced because the police have other things to do. I won't say any more than that. But what this does is it essentially reverses what the default position is. So it's been open to local authorities, certainly those with decriminalised parking enforcement, to say, well, we are going to use a TRO to ban parking on this street, on the pavements on this street, because it is getting in the way. You know, it might be that there's a care home there, and so it's more dangerous, or there's a primary school or whatever, to say for specific streets, we're going to ban pavement parking here and enforce it through decriminalised parking enforcement. But without that, pavement parking has not been subject to a specific prohibition in this sense. Now, that was seen as being a problem essentially because local authorities, again, do not have the time and resource available to map fully every pavement in their area and say, well, that one needs parking prohibited, that one doesn't. So the effect of this is to reverse the default situation and to say that on any footway, parking is prohibited unless the local authority puts an exemption order to say that you may park on that pavement, which will probably be done for example, where there are very narrow roads in sort of small areas and so on. So that is prohibited. Double parking is prohibited. Now, what double parking is defined as, and I'll have to watch out for this because I'm not sure how good a parker I am, but double parking is defined as parking more than 50 centimetres away from the curb. It do not have it because they've not applied for it and gone through the process. So what that means is, so what the Act does is it says, we don't have to apply for it, you can do this anyway, but you will not have the setup for it yet. So it's worth thinking about, if you're not a local authority with decriminalised enforcement, how you're going to go about doing that. Section 54 provides a specific power to outsource that to whoever else, because, you know, to allow for that. And then beyond that, the amount of the charge, mechanisms, appeals, etc., are all set up for regulations to fill in the details and deal with removals. And that is me. On time, I think. Any questions on the Transport Scotland bill or for anyone else?
I find the parking thing is just going to be so stressful. I mean, I have to have a small measuring tape with me at all times.
Yeah.
And I know I'll get caught in that because hopefully I sit in reverse parking. So, I do have a brother who's a policeman, however, so maybe I should be a bit more nice to him in future in case I need emergency dispensation.
I'll just say he ordered you to park there. You're cool.
Yeah. Okay. The one thing I did notice on the way through when you were doing the section on buses and franchising is a lot of new powers there for local authorities, but potentially giving stakeholder interest a fertile ground for judicial review. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the thing is where what you're doing is introducing a competing bus service, that it's perhaps going to be, you know, one thing because any loss that a bus company makes because you're competing with them, well, frankly, that's how markets work, right? But if you are introducing franchising schemes and you're going to have to be careful that the standards that you impose and the prices that you impose and all that type of thing are reasonable in a way that that you're not essentially saying, well, if you're going to run a bus here, you're going to have to do it for pennies.
Allow them to make a decent profit.
Yeah.
Okay, if we don't have any further questions for Jamie, just falls on me to thank you very much for attending today. It is Friday, it is 12:30, not quite crackerjack time, but getting there. I just would like to wish you all a very good weekend when it eventually comes, and hopefully that comes sooner rather than later. Thank you.